This week, it was announced that the Edinburgh International Book Festival has ended a 20-year sponsorship deal due to pressure from climate protesters. Investment company Baillie Gifford has been criticised for its investments in fossil fuels, and the chairman of the book festival said they did not think the event could be held safely in August under the threat of disruption by activists. The week before, the Hay Literary Festival dropped Baillie Gifford as sponsors over the firm's links to Israel and fossil fuel companies. So here to discuss this, I'm joined by the author and broadcaster Tiffany Jenkins. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, Tiffany, you've written about this before when there was an attempt at a boycott last year at the Edinburgh Festival, a similar kind of thing. Could you give us the background to this situation?
OK, well, in 2023, you had a bunch of people called Fossil Fuel Books. At that stage, you didn't know who they were anonymous. Get together a group of authors, including big names like Zadie Smith, Naomi Klein, to say that they would leave the book festival and unless they severed their links with Baillie Gifford, or Baillie Gifford stopped investing in fossil fuels. And then, horror of horror, Greta Thunberg pulled out. At that stage, it went a little bit quiet. Baillie Gifford made the point that actually, of their portfolio, 2% goes into fossil fuels. They're a big investor in future energy, things like Tesla, electric cars. So, in fact, compared to other firms, they're very progressive. They're probably the future of the solutions to climate change.
And
but
they don't make a big song and dance about all of their philanthropic
they do a ton of philanthropy that you just don't know about. They fund domestic violence shelters. They do all sorts of very, very good works. They are utterly quiet about it because it's not for virtue signalling.
But this year, it's very much the combination of Israel with the fossil fuel debate.
Well, this year, you had fossil fuel books pivoting with great principle to Gaza, which is even more tenuous for Baillie Gifford, and they've put out a statement saying they've got absolutely nothing to do with it. And I think it seems to be something to do with things like Amazon and a few other technology companies. So and in fact, if you're an author, you're heavily involved in books, obviously, which are very carbon intensive. So hypocrisy abounds, and Baillie Gifford is an extraordinarily poor target for these people. But what's interesting is how effective they've been.
Yes.
You know, they've taken down Hay, which Bill Clinton called the Woodstock of the mind. You know, they've taken down now Edinburgh after a 20-year partnership.
Yes.
Without this money, they probably won't go ahead. So why? Is it because of their coherent campaign? No. In my mind, it's the cowardice of the literary elite. Last year I tried to do an open letter to counter their open letter. And a number of big-name authors who are successful, prominent people said they couldn't put their name to something so public, even though they agreed with me.
This is interesting, isn't it? But that's more and more the case with the kind of the tribalism of our times when it comes to politics and ideology, is that people don't want to stick their head above the parapet and say, even if they know something is right. But isn't this a bit worrying in terms of what happens to arts festivals generally? Because don't artists rely on the corporate sector? We may not like to admit that. We may like to think it all comes from government, state sponsorship, Arts Council. It's not the case, is it?
No, and ideally you want a mixed funding stream. So you want the box office, you want people paying for their tickets, you want kind of that sort of money. You do want state sponsorship. You want all the money you can get. These things are really expensive to put on, particularly to keep prices low so that everybody can come. And Baillie Gifford also sponsored the kids programme, which is, free, I think. And then you do want corporate sponsorship. The reason why you want 3, if you like, is so you're not reliant on any.
Yes.
You know, there are strings attached to a lot of government funding.
Of course.
Particularly in terms of audiences and now more in terms of content.
Well,
you want freedom.
Yeah, really? I had a guest from the Arts Council here who was talking about how there was a certain degree of ideological capture within the Arts Council, which does inform some of its funding.
Very much so.
So it's important, isn't it, to have multiple streams of potential revenue. But what does this mean? I mean, a lot of this is coming from artists, from creatives, the very people that these festivals are there to support. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't.
Really?
I've seen it for about 20 years. This is sort of what you've got is this. Really, since the 1970s, you've had a crisis of purpose within arts organisations and artists, and they've sort of piggybacked onto any fashionable cause to gain legitimacy.
Yes.
Social inclusion. You know, under Blair, under Labour, you had museums rebranding themselves as centres for social inclusion, community outreach, and you've had sort of less and less talk of quality criticism. the point of books, you know, to make us think. Those sort of things are things that artists and I think the literary world now find quite hard to argue for. And you see this, there was a letter now finally way too late supporting somewhat, well, no, complaining about the abandonment of funding, unable to argue for corporate sponsorship. This is the Edinburgh authors, and unable to argue for the kind of book festival as a place of plurality. You know, this is a space that doesn't have to take an ideological line, that doesn't have to be political, that can open up conversations.
But why is it
they're unable to say that?
Well, why is it that so many arts festivals are now becoming quite homogenous when it comes to politics? Because you would have thought that they were... I understand very passionate artists and creatives getting on their high horse about stuff. They've done that forever. What I don't understand is the capitulation of those in charge of these festivals. Why they can't just say, you get to have your opinion, you get to scream and shout as much as you want, but we also get to have these other artists and creatives who won't necessarily agree with you.
I think it's a crisis of purpose. You know, they are unable really to talk about books and writing and thinking and arts for its own sake. It always has to be tied to something else. For some time, it was tied to the economy.
Yes.
You know, there was this idea of the knowledge economy and the creative economy and things like that. And what that masks is that this sort of hollowness, really.
Yes.
This absence. And I think that's obviously terribly unfortunate. There are artists and writers and thinkers out there doing good things. There are audiences who want that. But at the moment, those at the top of the game either believe it and can't say it out loud or don't believe it at all.
And what does this do for other artists and writers? Because this is obviously coming from a lot of the big names, those who can afford not to go to a book festival, those who can afford to lose that avenue of promotion. But there's a lot of artists and authors who do depend on these things.
Well, I think for the former, actually, they do lose out. I mean, I used to find Edinburgh in particular was a way of taking the temperature.
Right.
You know, you went, and it happened at the same time as the Fringe Festival and the International Festival. So you just had these thousands of people coming from all over the world, bursting with ideas and creativity, whether they're juggling or whatever, miming or doing another version of Macbeth. Oh,
there's a lot.
But there was a lot going on, and comedy, of course.
Yes.
But what you could do is you could go to a mix of events, and you just had a sense of what people were really thinking and worrying about and talking about, and that I think has gone. So I think everybody loses out. Your big name author needs that to know how to write about the world. You know, we all need the kind of the productivity of a collision of ideas that these festivals bring.
So what happens next? Is it the case that the book festivals might change their minds by the time we get to next year, or will this just put us... Is this just setting a precedent that's going to be forevermore? It's
been like watching a slow-motion car crash. They've lost... I mean, the Edinburgh Book Festival in particular has had to move venue and to partnership with the university, so it's gone from a beautiful garden to the dead kind of lecture theatre of bureaucracy. I think these festivals are in big trouble, and they'll want more government sponsorship because they still sort of think that they are entitled to it, which means I think they'll probably become smaller, less fleet of foot and less interesting, and probably less popular.
OK, well, that's a bit of a downward note for the end, but thank you ever so much, Tiffany, for joining me. Really appreciate it.